Hello, everyone. We are live and ready to go. Thank you guys for joining us the last two nights of these conversations. And tonight is our last conversation leading up to our school board forums. My name is Kenny Francis. I am the Vice President of Indivisible New Orleans. I'm excited to be joining y'all for our last night of these primer conversations. If you haven't tuned in yet, what we've been doing is we've been talking with some subject matter experts about our local school system here, because our school system is unique compared to pretty much every other system in the state and against most systems in the country. So if you missed our previous conversations, I would highly recommend you go back and watch them, because I learned a ton. And I know that there's a lot of really, really good information that was given. The first one we had 2 nights ago was with Neva Buckus from the Louisiana Budget Project, who did a great explanation of how school funding works, not just in Louisiana as a state, but how it works here in New Orleans. Last night, we had Amy Grainer, who used to be one of the top administrators at Enroll NOLA, which is our common enrollment system here in New Orleans, which is different than how most districts around the country and in this state do enrollment. And so that was another really good conversation that I would recommend you go back and watch. You can find both of those conversations on our YouTube page just by searching Indivisible New Orleans. I'm really excited about this last conversation we have here. I have another one of my good friends, Angele, with me. I'm going to introduce her in a second. I just want to remind you that you can submit questions for Angele by going to the website Slido, that's SLIDO.com, and typing in the event code Charter School Oversight. And I'm going to actually double check that that's what it actually says, because I forgot as I was saying it. Sorry, the event code is Charter Schools. So if you want to submit a question, go to Slido, SLIDO.com, and the event code is Charter Schools. And once you type in your question, it'll pop up for me and I can ask it. And it works a little bit like a social media website. If you go on there and you see someone has typed in a question that they had already that you like, you can like it. And the questions with the most likes will pop up to the top. And so I'll know what people want to ask. I'm really excited to have Angele with me tonight. She's a good friend of mine. She's worked in the system for a long time. She is a great, great resource. Is going to give us a lot of knowledge here. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with her. Welcome. And thanks for joining us, Angele.
Thank you. I'm excited. All things charter school oversight. Just such a simple little topic.
Exactly. Very, very complicated. Angele, could you do us a favor and introduce yourself a little bit? Let people know who you are.
Mm-hmm. I'm Angele Delarge. I am from New Orleans, which is most places that wouldn't be like a qualifier, but it is.
Yes, it is.
But I'm from New Orleans. I taught for 7 years, and then I moved over to coaching and development. Then I worked for Teach for America as a coach. I did all kinds of things. I did hiring at different points. I did strategic planning, but mostly I did coaching and development of teachers and leaders that were alumni. I always called myself the unicorn in the office because I wasn't a core member. And I think the perspective gave me like a ton of insight into, old New Orleans understanding of charters and like reform, and then like New Orleans understanding in a way. And then I worked in talent for a bit, and now this is going into my 3rd year with the Association of Charter Schools. And I lead all things NOLA, which is another amalgamation of a whole bunch of things. But in terms of like elected officials, policy, understanding OPSB, understanding Act 91, understanding school governance, it's kind of all falls in my bucket in relation to New Orleans.
Thank you for that. You do a lot. And so just to give folks sort of like an overview of how this is going to work, as Angele alluded to at the top, it's a complicated subject. I used to, as I said on previous of these, I used to work at the school district, and it is a complicated system, even for those of us that have been steeped in it for a long time. And so the way that we're going to frame this conversation to try to make it simple, especially for those of you out there who might be watching now or who will watch back on this, who are not as familiar with how our system works, I think the best way to do this conversation is to frame it in a way where we sort of just compare what a traditional school district looks like and what our school district looks like, and then take your questions from there. And so if you have questions, ask them along the way. I'm going to do my best to keep track and keep an eye on Slido. Again, if you want to submit a question, you can go to Slido, that's SLIDO.com, and type in the event code Charter Schools, and the questions will pop up for me. And I'll try to ask them as we go. And so we're going to start with something simple, Angele. So when people think about our school district, it's unique in a lot of ways, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm just going to describe how the relationship between a school board and a superintendent in schools works in a typical district. And then I would love for you to go through and explain what that looks like that's the same in our district and what that looks like that's different in our district. So if you were in a different city in this country, and the way that school districts work in most cities is that you have a publicly elected school board that you run for that's an elected position. Those people, they hire or appoint a superintendent of schools. And that superintendent of schools has very top-down, like centralized power where they're basically the principal for everyone. They're the leader for the whole district. And that superintendent sets policy with the consent of their elected school board that happens for the district. And in most districts, it's very top-down. So what the superintendent says goes. They decide all of the major policy issues. And so in some districts, it can be extremely hands-on. So even in other districts in this state, you have superintendents who decide what the curriculum is. They decide which teachers get hired or not, or what teachers get prioritized or not. They decide what the budgets for each school in their district looks like. They decide all sorts of day-to-day operations that comes down in a very top-down, centralized way. So that's sort of like what a traditional district looks like in most places in the state and most places in the country. What I just described looks very different in our district. So I'm going to let Angele take over here. So what does that relationship from the school board to the superintendent to schools look like here in New Orleans?
Yeah, so I'll start. The school board elected officials, they are responsible for the constituents that voted them in, the same as a traditional school board. The difference is our district isn't a district per se. They're an authorizer. So our superintendent is his relationship is similar in terms of the board holds him accountable. They do his evaluation. They figure out, all the goals that they have and things like that. The difference is our board tells the superintendent's job is to create policies and oversight for for new charter schools, for charter renewals, for accountability. So all the things that are supposed to be the checks and balances to keep charter schools, like one of the promises is like with more autonomy comes more like accountability, and that should be it's like they all need to be in balance for things to work, right? And so the superintendent's job is like at the end of the day, he can choose to thinking about what his oversight looks like. He can choose to keep schools open. He can choose to close schools. And it's not a choice by like, I just decided. It's a choice based on very clear metrics, which is in our charter school accountability framework. And then from that, he creates policies or accountability or metrics. So he can also create additional documents needed to ensure that people are accountable to the metrics on their contract. And so basically you have a school board that hires the superintendent to be the person that approves charter schools, holds them accountable, closes them, and or transitions them to another authorizer. Within that, you still have a significant amount of oversight that needs to happen of the superintendent from the board. Now, that's where it gets a little tricky in New Orleans because the board isn't necessarily creating policies. The policies are usually recommended by the superintendent's office, which is NOLA Public Schools, what you guys all know as the district. And our school board members can actually yield a lot of power. And I think that one of the narratives currently is that the school board members can't do a lot, right? Like being charters actually stifles them. And that's not true. They actually create, because they oversee, they are the person that holds the contract with every school. They are the person who have signed the contract along with every charter school board. And so they can recommend policies that they want created. They can amend policies. They don't have to approve anything that the superintendent brings before them, to be honest. They actually can send them back to the drawing board. Not that we want that to happen all the time, because that would be extremely ineffective, but there is a lot of power in still being an elected board member. And that board member still has the same amount of power in terms of ensuring that the community's needs, community voices are heard, and that is what is fueling the work that they do. So it's a little bit it's a little different in the way that, you know, it's managed. But at the end of the day, the school board's powers are still significant. They're not choosing curriculum, but they can definitely choose, you know, what your curriculum needs to include at a basic minimum level, right? They can, and this is not, and charter schools do have autonomy. They have autonomy in a lot of ways, but the board can still decide what the minimum standards for excellence in our district is.
Thank you for that. And so just, I want to tease out a couple of things you said there. So like one thing I think that is important to like highlight that you said, that I think, like you said, the narrative around our schools doesn't typically address this, is that the contract to run a charter school is between the charter board and OPSB, the elected school board members.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, the power comes from a legal document that says, you know, if let's say, Angele, you're the board president and I'm a board member of a charter organization, this contract is technically between you and me. And it says that you're giving me this contract to run this school. And if I meet the terms of that contract, I get to keep doing it. If I don't meet the terms of that contract, or I do stuff that you feel violates that contract, you can do something about that. It isn't just like you get a contract and then you're free to do whatever you want for the rest of time. Exactly. Which I do think is like a thing to clarify, because I don't think that enough people in our city understand that while the district doesn't directly run schools, it's certainly, because of the charter contract, does still wield a lot of influence over the operations of the schools.
They also decide, just as a point, they can change the contract. When it's time to renew a contract, if there are things that they felt were missing, and we don't want to, like, the benefit of having schools be able to like have curriculum that meets the needs of their students and adapt, and all those things are really important. But they can choose, like, what are the things that they missed before, right? Like, what are the things? And so even the terms of the contract is not stagnant. It is a contract that evolves over time. The contracts that were signed, 5 years ago are not the same contracts that are signed, in the new round of renewals.
And to clarify, because I think one of the things I've been trying to highlight in these conversations that I've been having this week is, in a district like ours, where it's a decentralized district, where our school district and our school board isn't directly running schools, I think one of the things I believe very strongly is, as a board member, one of the things you're signing up to be is an advocate, is to advocate for the community that elected you and for the kids and the families that you're representing, in ways that you should have essentially more time to do, since you're not part of the direct running of schools. And so I think one of the things I want to talk about specifically is the charter contract, where who decides what goes into the charter contract, what those look like where does that come from?
So who decides what goes in? It's two-sided, right? OPSB is the contract holder, like that is your elected school board. NOLA PS has a significant role in making sure like certain things are included in that contract. So it is I will say it's a love child of both the superintendent and the board, but at the end of the day, it's a legal document between a charter board and an OPSB. Therefore, it is not like people often talk about the school leaders being able to do whatever they want, right? Like, and the reality is, like, the contract is not with the school leader. Autonomy does not lie with a person. Autonomy lies with a board. Autonomy lies with the people on the charter board. And the school leader is an employee of that board. So school leaders aren't just like, rampantly doing whatever they want without any accountability, because they are an employee also. Unlike, I think most people tend to it's confusing, right? Like, we talked about autonomy, and usually you see the face, you see the leader, but at the end of the day, it's the board. And that contract is one that's created as with an elected body.
And I want to talk about that part a little bit more, because I think that's another big misconception. I think one of my goals for this conversation is for the two of us to try to clear up as many misconceptions for folks as possible. I think that's another one. I think you touched on a really important one there, where there is this idea publicly that that charter school leaders, CMO leaders, whether it be the head of school principal for a single site or a CMO leader for a charter school that has multiple schools, they basically have this like complete unilateral power, and they don't answer to anyone except for maybe their charter contract. And I want to like reinforce the point you just made, that all of the school leaders have a boss, and the boss is their board. And so if you are someone who's unhappy with the way that your charter is responding to a concern you have or to a need that you feel is not being addressed, they do have a boss. The boss is their charter board. Our charter boards are the bosses. They are required to evaluate and hire, et cetera, the school leader. So at the end of the day, that's who they answer to within their organization. The same way in our professional jobs, you and I both have bosses that, like, if people were unhappy with what we were doing, there is someone that we would have to answer to.
And my boss has a boss because she has a board also. So I think, like, most of our bosses, like, there's a very little, like, in nonprofit or schools and like anything dealing with education, where there's not going to be a group of people that are like more responsible than a single person. That is something I really want people to understand, because oftentimes, like, you know, when people say like a leader isn't responding to something, well, like, it is really important to go through your school leader, right? It is important to go to the teacher, go to the assistant principal, go to the principal. And we're not saying that has to take like months. It could be within the realm of like a 2-day period, right? But like, then you can also like contact the board president in order to share your concerns directly with them. They're going to ask you if you went through these protocols, because it's really important that they know if the school leader is responding or not, right? Like, that is a point of reference that you would want to have, a board member should have, if something really important wasn't brought to them. So I do think that's a really important part. It's not like protocol is for any other reason besides to make sure that everyone can equitably engage in the conversation, and that it's also a proof point or a checkpoint to see like, hey, if you went to the leader and they solved your problem, that's amazing. But if you're coming to me, that means I need to know if you told them and they just did nothing, or I need to know if you told them, and like, I need to figure out if your concern is the concern that they heard, right? Like, they need to figure out what is happening there.
Yeah. Okay. So like, I want to keep us moving a little bit, because there's a couple of things I definitely want to come back to. Okay. So in a traditional district, you have an elected board, hires or appoints a superintendent. Superintendent has like very top-down centralized power and basically tells everyone in the district what they're going to do. Our district is different, where you have an elected board who hires a superintendent, and the board signs contracts with charter organizations that run our schools based upon metrics they have to meet. And if they don't meet those metrics, the schools get taken away from them or they get closed altogether, which is a whole nother conversation that we probably won't get into. Because we can do a whole thing about just like closure and transformation.
I have thoughts too.
So I want to talk next thing about, so like, let's talk about autonomy for a minute. So in a traditional district, when you think about things like HR policies, who gets hired on what credentials, who gets fired for what reasons, et cetera, that's a district policy. You have a district that says, you know, you must be a teacher with blah, blah, blah qualifications, X amount of years if you're going to come work in our district. And here is a unified evaluation system for like how you get to keep or not keep your job. Also, in a traditional district, if there's a teacher union that's involved in there, the teacher union bargains directly with the district, and there's a contract with the district that says, we, this teacher union of X city with this district of X city, have a contract that says, here are all the things that's going to happen legally between teachers and the school district in terms of like how long the contract is, what, you know, workplace things that you put into a contract, compensation, salary scales, tenure, et cetera. How does that work here? And like, how is it different in relation to things around HR and hiring? And specifically, if there was a conversation about unions, because I want to specifically talk about unions, because I think that's a very big misconception about our system when it comes to unions.
Yes. First, we all have to follow the law based in our state. That's like I think another thing, like, they don't create HR policies that are against like our Constitution, against Civil Rights Act. Like, they all have to be in compliance with our federal and state and local laws. So every school's HR, it should have some form of due process. It should have like clear defining ways, like you can have a grievance, like your all whistleblower protections are still like are still there. I think that when it comes to how people view, I think people see, you know, I think as a country, especially as of people that are in a predominantly Black, urban, poor city, right? Like, and I don't think poor is like I want to caveat that I don't think poor is like a qualifier for anything else besides like economics. And I think those same poor people are rich with a whole lot of things because I've been poor. But I think that we tend to think like whatever makes us feel secure, like whatever way that's been messaged is the thing that's really important. And I think we have talked about unions in a way that talks about the benefits. And I think there are definitely benefits to people feeling like mandates on feeling heard and valued and all of those things. However, I do think like there are things that happen when you're in a union that aren't like the best for teachers. Like I've been a teacher in a district school. I've been a teacher in a charter school. And I think that my salary didn't have to be a $600 raise every year, right? Like I think our teachers have an opportunity to get paid significantly more. I think our teachers have direct influence because they have a board they can go to. Our teachers have a lot more flexibility. However, I think that if teachers aren't being heard from all of those parties, right? Like we have options outside of a national union. And I think that one of those is like some schools have, you know, individual school unions, right? Like so Morris Jeff or Ben Franklin High School. And I think that if you're getting to a point where you need a union, right? Because I also think like when people are taken care of and happy and they feel like their school values them, that's not usually the conversation, right? But I do think that if that is a thing being talked about, I think when I think about bargaining for teachers and HR, I do think, and this is a personal plus, it's also just like experience and just understanding the law. If you have a school-based union, that union actually understands your kids. They know your school leaders. It's a whole lot harder for a school leader to, you know, like carte blanche, not care about what you're saying. When they work with you, they know you. You're not going to ask for anything crazy that's at the service of your students because those students matter to you, right? Like there is a shared responsibility with each other that I think subverts the usual tension of like, are we working, like, does it mean like to be on the side of teachers means we're not on the side of kids? Or if you're on the side of kids, then you're not on the side of teachers. And I don't think that's I think that we have an opportunity because we're charters, right? To create like, to kind of like re-envision what actually serves our teachers, our faculty, our staff members, and like how that can push conversations along much more clearly and effectively for our students and our families.
Thank you for that. And I want to go back through and sort of like clarify and also like maybe add on to a few things you said, a few points you made there. So I think in thinking about what you said, like, no, there isn't sort of like a district HR that you can appeal to if you have sort of a personnel issue with your charter school in our system. Essentially, you have to deal with that individually based on your school. But like you said, every charter school is held to the same state laws around whistleblower protections, et cetera, that you can't do anything that's illegal. And so if you feel like your school has violated those, in the same way, if it was a traditional district, that's like a legal issue that you have to go through a legal process to address that. And on the topic of unions, I think the misconception I wanted to clear up is I think there's a common misconception in our system, and I'll be frank, I've heard this from many friends I know that are teachers, that you can't be in a union in the city. And I think that's just not true. I think the reality of it.
The point, I was in a charter school and a union at the same, and I like a national union at that time. So that is definitely.
And so I want to say definitively that like you can be in a union if you are in a charter school in the city. I think the thing that like is the misconception comes from the fact that there isn't a centralized union that's negotiating directly with the centralized district like you will see in other cities. Because there isn't a collective bargaining contract, because that's not how it works, because all of the charter schools, because of that contract we previously talked about, they have the autonomy over their HR. And so a collective contract of like teachers from a centralized union contracting with the district wouldn't actually legally make sense in our district, given the fact that we have a decentralized system. But I want to say for all the teachers that are watching this, that may watching this, you can organize at your school. As Angele said, you can start a union, you can have a union at your school-based charter, just like Morris Jeff has done. I mean, Ben Franklin is the other one, right? We have 2 of those in our city. And so at individual schools, teachers can decide to unionize and go through the whole process of getting recognized by the board, et cetera, the way that you start a union. And so that's one thing I wanted to specifically talk about, because it's like a thing I hear. I've been here for almost 10 years. It's a thing I hear over and over and over again about teachers not being allowed to do this. And I want teachers to know that you are empowered to do this. You got to do the work just like any other organizing scenario. If you want a union at your school, you're going to have to meet with your colleagues and get together and figure out what your collective desires are, and like come to a place where you can collectively bargain together. But we wanted to clarify that for folks about how you go through that process.
Because I didn't even. I was like, well, of course you could join in.
I think it's a common misconception that folks have, where you and I have both experiences, and I think anyone watching this knows that like there's a lot of just like confusion about what is or is not true, and interpersonal relationships that went one way or another way. And I think like if we do nothing else tonight, I would love for folks to like walk away from this knowing exactly what it is and what it isn't, and like from there you can advocate, you can push your school, et cetera. So another thing I want to talk about is let's talk briefly about accountability. I don't know if we'll have enough time to do the whole turnaround, closure, et cetera conversation, but let's talk about like what accountability looks like. So in a traditional district, what accountability looks like is, so again, I'm going to keep trying to like do like a review of the things that we covered already. So traditional district, you have an elected school board, hires a superintendent. Superintendent has very top-down centralized power from their administration, tells everybody what they're going to do. So in a traditional district, what accountability for schools looks like is the superintendent, and likely coming from state standards, says schools, your metrics are this or this, right? You have to have this scores on your test scores, et cetera. And then if you don't meet those metrics, the superintendent in a traditional district decides what happens next. And what that typically looks like in a traditional district is a lot of people getting fired. Like if you look at poor performing districts around the country, typically what happens is if you have 10 schools in the district and these 3 schools every year have the worst scores, those people get fired. The teachers get fired, the principal gets fired, the assistant principal gets fired. That's typically what happens, is you have a lot of hirings and firings, and that's like what accountability looks like. So you don't have schools opening and closing in that sense. You just have adults getting replaced repeatedly in districts where people are poor performing. And now I would like you to explain how is that different in our district? You have the fun job here.
Right? Okay, so accountability looks like significantly different, right? One of the things is like, people often talk about, so your school meets the standards or not. So they can be approved for a charter based on what their scores look like, based on what the metrics are. Your school can be approved for 3, 5 to 10 years, right? And then this year's a little different because there are no scores. And so we won't even get to the caveat of that, but there are like efforts being made to make sure that they are still holding high standards. One of the things is like you get closed. Like say you are your first round of contract, it's 5-year, right? Like you have 5 years to prove what you said in your application, that your mission, your values, like you are actually making those things happen. Then there are like, that's where the next thing that happens is the smaller renewal areas, right? Based on like, if you're not performing well if you're F, then you're more likely than not going to get closed. There is like discretionary, like ability for the superintendent to have discretionary power there. More often than not, they're following the law. And so this is where the big tension comes in, because I don't think anyone wants people who are, anyone wants like schools to continue to fail their children, right? Like, I don't think any of us want that. What's most frustrating is the disruption of it all, right? Feeling like no one cares about, the heritage of the school. No one cares about the people that worked hard. Everyone's narrative becomes like you failed kids, as opposed to like the realities of like what happens from the board to the leadership to this classroom and all those things. And so what happens is actually your school is most likely not getting closed. Your school is getting a new operator. So the thing that does happen in a traditional district is when they do all that firing, they hire a new administration, right? They hire a new administration who brings in teachers. That's pretty similar to what happens when a school closes. They are finding a new board, which is the new the new people to ensure that the school is going to meet the vision and needs. And then the principal is hired, the school leader, our principal is hired. And then they bring in, but some of those people, if you love the principal at your school, the new board, the new authorizer can hire that principal. That's not something that's not like, that can't happen. There should be opportunity, like they have to engage with community, have to talk with people. But I do think the effort is to make sure that we don't have schools that feel predominantly Black and then some brown communities based on the fact that they are they're in poverty areas. People's standards get lower. Like, people keep saying like, well, it's really hard. I think what people are trying to do is actually say like, our kids are more than like their zip code. Our kids are more than like the barriers around them. And we have to find balance in making sure like we're aware of and like cognizant of those barriers and not dismissive of them, but at the same time know that our kids are like brilliant, right? Like, our kids do all kinds of things that I think about. Like, my kids are more sheltered now, right? Like, I think like I had the wherewithal. I was ironing my clothes at 7. I was like doing all kinds of things. I was making up games because we didn't have money to buy them. I just think of like how brilliant our kids are, right? And we want to ensure that like the people around them are supporting them and understanding that for themselves and growing. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that closing means like we just don't care anymore and we just like it all goes back to nothing and starts over again. And that doesn't have to be what it is. But I do think it takes the community, the parents, everyone being educated on the possibilities that exist for them, as opposed to feeling like, you know, things are being done to them. And I think that's some of the tension that arises from our accountability standards. But at the end of the day, our accountability, it's pretty clear. You can all go to NOLA PS's website. You can look at it. I also will add, there's some cool stuff happening. The accountability office, Dr. Kelly Peterson she works for the state now, but Kevin George is leading the accountability office. And I think they have some interesting things around innovations for how to support schools when they're failing, not just they're failing, you should do better, and now you're gone. Like, that's really not the best. And I think they're listening. And I think NOLA PS is trying to address some of those like concerns by creating these like, what happens if a school is at a D? What happens if a school is at a C? When we first start a school, what are the like training wheels we're giving them to succeed? And not just this, I think you learn from mistakes, right? This carte blanche, like, you're smart, you're compelling, you have a great, application, you're going to run a school and be awesome. It's kind of like, we know that doesn't always happen, even with brilliant people who have great ideas. And so finding ways to like mitigate the cost to families and students, most of all, is really important in our accountability process. And I think everyone's committed to trying to figure out what that looks like.
So I want to move to another issue to talk about like the differences. So in a traditional district, when you look at more operational things, so in a traditional district, when you think about budgets, the superintendent's office, that they decide, every school gets this amount and we're going to prioritize blah, blah, blah this year. So like, let's say I'm the superintendent of no name parish and I'm a traditional school district. I, as a superintendent and my administration, would have to say, all right, everyone's budget's going to be this. You can hire this many teachers. You can hire this amount of kind of teachers. Also, we're going to do this curriculum this year because I like this one and I think it's going to work better than the one we had last year. And I also centralize things like busing is centralized. Like the district just has like a fleet of buses, or they have a contract to deal with the buses. Things like facilities are centralized, where the district owns the buildings, the district's responsible for upkeep, etc. Things like special education are centralized, where in a traditional district, if you have a child that needs to be identified for an IEP, you go through a centralized district process where there's like district staff that come and do the evaluation. The IEP is written at the central office. The parents are brought in, they sign the IEP, and then even the services for the special education are delivered through like a centralized process. How is that different in our district?
Okay.
I just gave you a lot there. Come on.
Yeah. So let's start. I'll say the facilities, the district owns them. They're theirs. They actually they manage. if you participate in a meeting, you'll see they give you an update on their facilities, like more often than not during the board meetings. They handle the financial like distribution for like upkeep and for monitoring and all those things. When it comes to like general operations, like buses and things, the schools have a budget based on their MFP. And you guys talked about this before in, what is it, last night?
Where it was the first night. It was on Tuesday.
And that means like based on your students, and I actually think this is probably one of the best things we have in New Orleans is like based on where your student, like where the resources are needed most, right? Like if you have students that you have a high concentration of ELL students where you get additional dollars because you're going to actually like, support them in additional ways. If you have students that have been incarcerated previously, there's additional resources that's needed to like serve those students. If you have students with special needs, the one area that has changed in like the last iteration of MFP and now is like there are extra dollars allocated to certain gifted programs, but they aren't as much as special education for say a student with special needs. And by special needs, it's more like things that are just barriers for those students and not necessarily like a leg up that they have because and so that is one thing. The other thing is we have when it comes to SPED, right? Like every school is accountable to the law. The district offices, which is NOLA PS, they actually have a team that does oversight to kind of check schools and to support them. But at the end of the day, a school is responsible for making sure that they are following all legal responsibilities for their students. And so that includes all IDEA, that includes like tracking their time, their numbers. I think that is one of the hardest things I actually think it's really difficult at a school level. So with handling every school in the district, it's actually really difficult. And I think that people have a feeling because I think one thing I want to just put out there is like, you have more information because we are all charters, right? Like you learn about every single thing. There's no big network of like the district to cover schools that are bad actors, right? There's no big opportunity to actually like, people can feel like it's really like chaotic, like it's worse because it's chaotic. But I think we just have way more information because our schools are different and you have a direct like way to like communicate what's happening through social media and all those things. And so I do think like we've all got to get better with how we serve our students with special needs. I think that is just like bottom line. I don't think that any school is like, I don't think most schools are like nefariously like working to not serve students. I think that we need additional support and funding for all the things. I think I also think like schools are supposed to be held accountable to them, like to serving their students. And the district's job is to ensure that they are doing that. And so there is a reality, like, even though the district they're not responsible for the outcome, they are responsible for making sure that it's happening. The only other difference I will say.
So it's oversight rather than service delivery. That's the big difference.
Big difference, but services have to be provided. The school has to figure it out. Parents still have to be part of the IEP meeting with the teacher, with the school leader, like whoever the special education lead is at the school. And so those things don't change. Like the requirements are still there. The only difference is who is responsible for ensuring it happens and who is responsible for holding them accountable to that.
Gotcha. Okay, I want to cycle back through a couple of things because like there are some things that we talked about that are like obvious sticking points and sticky points that I think there have been a large diversity of opinions about in our system. And then we had a similar conversation like this with Amy last night. And I want to be clear to anyone that's watching this, I'm not asking Angele to speak for the entire district and everyone's opinion. I'm just asking her opinion. Let's go back to our first point where we're talking about the relationship between the school board, the superintendent, and the schools, where in a traditional district, you have elected school board, hired superintendent, centralized power telling everybody what to do from a very top-down way with schools. In our district, you have an elected board, a hired superintendent, and then charter boards who get contracts signed to run the charters individually. there is a criticism of our system that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, that in our system, we've added an extra step to get to public accountability, where in a traditional district, if you're upset with the way that a school or even a group of schools are being run, you can go directly to the principal, and then if it doesn't work, you go directly to the superintendent. And if it doesn't work, then you go yell at the people you elected for public office. And then if they don't do it just what you want, or they don't make it better, you can elect someone different. But there's a criticism of our system. In our system, if you have an issue, you have to go first to the school leader of your school, and then you've got to go to the charter board of the nonprofit that runs your school, and then you can go to the district, and then you can go to your elected school board member. And so there's a criticism that some folks have that we've added an extra step that makes it harder for families to hold their schools accountable to meeting their needs. I'm curious your thoughts about that.
My personal thoughts.
Yeah, of course.
I actually think that so in a traditional district, it's not that simple, right? There's a bureaucracy in there, right? There's the regional, the person that oversees the regional area of those schools in this particular zip code, right? Then there's the person who's in charge of either the academic person for that region. And then there's this other person. And then there's this other person. And usually the superintendent is not listening to you. And that is just the reality. I think the superintendent is actually way more covered because there are less people actually engaged in how to hold you accountable. And that comes from the idea, as a parent, I can go to my school's board if I'm really angry. I can go to the board and say, you, and you. Why is this not happening? I don't know. Kenny, you're on a board. Do you want to feel personally responsible for not serving a kid that you have signed a contract legally that you can then get sued for not?
No, I do not.
Exactly. And then you then feel personally responsible for fixing that. And so more often than not, I think you then have a board if say the district is say no PS is causing the problem they see. They're going to go to the superintendent. And your boards are full of, parents, but they're also full of community members in very different areas that actually hold a lot of influence. And so I think that my ability to go speak to my school's board about my problem and get it solved I'm more likely to get it solved than going to the school board meeting where there's competing. The needs of my kids at Bricolage are not going to be the same as the kids at Lusher, right? The needs of my kids at Bricolage aren't going to be the same as the kids at Morris Jeff. It's going to be different. And so I think that when a district is trying to solve everybody's problem from one angle, that's really hard to happen. I think that the problem is more so about people kind of being okay with letting go of what was to figure out what do I do now? And then we can start fixing or changing or adjusting and shifting what doesn't work now, as opposed to consistently and continuously comparing. Well, we used to be able to do this, but we used to have schools that were failing kids for 30 years, right? We don't want that anymore. And so the reality is I do think it's a more personal experience, even when I think it is hard when you don't feel you understand what any of it is, when you don't understand your point of entry. And I think that is the bigger concern, is how do we start, how do we, even through my role, how do we start creating points of entry that are clear, that isn't me going to school and saying, hey, I've been hearing some rumblings on this thing, or, we can create pathways that everyone can be their best advocate and everyone can figure out the best pathway to be the best advocate for their kids or just their community.
Thank you for that and for that opinion. And I want to talk about charter boards for a minute, but I want to hold myself accountable. It's like you mentioned, I am on a charter board myself. And I would challenge my fellow charter board members around the city that I think that, to one of the points you made there, is to be more visible and to be more available and more obviously visible and available to your school community. Because I think joining a charter board is an enormous responsibility. I mean, think about all the things that you just explained of the way the system works, and particularly all the legal responsibilities of that go into a charter contract. And I think I would challenge everybody who's in a charter board in this city to be more visible for your families. Because I think you're right. I think that a lot of the consternation that comes around the way that people are able to or not able to address grievances in our system, the issues aren't very different than what you see like in other cities. Like that, you go anywhere in the country and you see similar types of problems that people have at their school. They feel like their kid's not learning. They feel like their teachers aren't doing enough, or they feel like an administrator isn't doing enough, or this need is not met, or this legally protected right isn't happening. Like kids and families have similar problems around schools because public education is a large, enormous system that even though ours functions a little bit differently, it has a lot of the same problems. It's largely underfunded. It's very segregated. Like that's not very different.
A hybrid. I would like, people think we're like, like tried and true charters, right? Like we're actually a hybrid. New Orleans charters aren't like charters in California or Florida or anywhere else. Like there is not this, it is a different, like our laws are really strong in Louisiana, believe it or not. Like we actually have like, you have every charter, like even in DC, there's not open, you don't have like, they don't have to be required to have open records requests, right? Like we have like way more transparency, like accountability for like finances. And so I do want to say like that the reality is like our charters give you a little bit of both, right? Like they're saying what Act 91 says is actually what it works to do, right? Is to give schools the autonomy they need in the most important areas while acknowledging that there needs to be like a community-based, like it needs to be led by elected officials. It needs to be supported through like a more comprehensive district. So just FYI, like it's definitely not a charter in the sense that you get across the country. It's actually a much more like tightly held like account of what charters are.
Comparatively.
Yes, comparatively.
And like obviously compared to a traditional district where it's very top down, that's not as true. Which I think is like the only thing that people are really ever comparing it to is like one traditional way and this way. But yeah, I think that thought that I was saying is like I think that like one of the things that I would say on a personal level that like needs to improve about our system is that charter board members and specifically the leaders on charter boards need to do the work and do more work to like be more visible and accountable to their school community so that folks feel like they have that entry point to like have grievances or issues addressed. So it's not feeling, because I can see the criticism where it's like if you went to the teacher, then you went to the principal, then you went to the board, and then you went to the superintendent, then you went to the school board, that after all that not having your thing addressed and like and if there's like resistance, it's like getting a response to it, I can see how people get to the point where it's like, well, you added a bunch of steps for me and I'm still not getting my problem solved. And so I think that like with that autonomy, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I also think like what I want to put is like, there's also the reality that, charters have created a much more like customer service based like type of education, right? So you have like people that have significant issues. But I remember like my parents didn't have, it was like, you like it or not. Like, it was like, you're gonna, like our principals were not like, it was very, I think we forget like, with some of the flexibility comes like without the awareness of like how many different needs can be expected to be met at one time. And I do think schools should meet the needs of all of the students that they serve. I also think like there are times when like your little baby is not the only baby in the classroom. And I would be remiss if I didn't count that. Like, I think for teachers, right? Like when they're dealing with like one parent that's louder than everyone else, at the disservice to every other student, like there are those mitigating things. And I do think a lot of times those parents will say the part of that story. And like, as a parent, I check myself, like you can ask my son's teacher, I sent her an email questioning something. I was like, I'm not trying to be disrespectful of your authority and all these things, but I kind of was trying to be like, but I don't think this works, right? And like, and sorry, Miss Moore. But I think like at the end of the day, like, it is really difficult when you have like a school full of kids and like you can feel like it is hard. But I do think a lot of it has to do with like who do leaders go with to understand like what they should be focusing on. I think we don't have as much leader development, but we have a lot of leader responsibility. I also think this does not, I want to put this caveat, Kenny, because this does not mean that school leaders, they are school leaders. That is what they do all day. Board members, that they are not saying, board members, Kenny's not saying, hey, go into school and start directing everybody, tell the gym teacher what to do.
No.
What he's saying is like, literally be at events. Say, I am a person, I am here. This is why I do what I do. My husband, since he is on the same board as Kenny, and like there are times where he's like, I'm gonna come visit. And there's like a couple kids that really like, they're kids that he knows and he understands, and I think that deepens the level of responsibility when things happen.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is that like I don't think it's any different than any sort of other nonprofit or organization in general, where you're a governing board. Your job is to govern. I'm not saying operationally run the school. You hired a school leader for a reason. The school leader's job is to run the school. Your job is to govern. And what I'm just saying is I think that like with that autonomy comes the responsibility.
But there should be a responsibility of having primary information for boards. And I think that is one of the things that is like the biggest gap, right? Like I think most boards believe like they are fully understand what is happening without realizing if all of your information comes from one source, like if it is through your board meeting, your school leader, and that is not saying in any way that school leaders are not trying to be transparent and all those things, but I do think it is important to say, I saw this myself. I am
absolutely.
I have seen this X, Y, and Z. And I think primary information is a way for boards to actually like kind of like get their like really start getting deep into like, hey, what am I holding you accountable to? What does this look like in your life?
I guess what I'm trying to say is it requires engagement, like high engagement. You sign up, you can't be passive. Because like, I actually don't think what we're talking about is very different than you and I have both been teachers. It's not very different than being a teacher. As a teacher, ideally in a school that really supports you and like gives you autonomy that you need, ideally what that would look like is that you as a teacher, Angele, would have the power and autonomy over running your classroom the way you know how. Because I hired you to teach this class, and it's your job to like write the lessons, deal with the parents, deal with the students, figure out what the needs are, and like run your classroom autonomously. But if I'm the school leader, my job is to govern you. My job is to support you when you need supported, hold you accountable where you need to be held accountable. And I love the part you said about getting primary information. As a school, there's not a single principal in the world that like doesn't check in on their teachers. You don't just like say like, hey, I'm gonna trust that you showed up every day. I'm gonna trust that you taught your kids. I'm gonna trust that stuff is happening in your classroom. No, you're gonna go visit. You're gonna see if they're there. First of all, if they're there, you're gonna see, like, you're gonna go observe and see how the class is doing. You're gonna look at their data and see if their kids are learning. You're gonna check in with families through some measure and see if the families are feeling like they're being supported the way they need to do. And I'm just saying that I think that like one of the things I think that like we can do better on as a city is that for us to think about school governance that way from a board level, where it's like in the same way, it's like, no, I'm not saying to show up at the school as a board member and be like, I think you should have, this dismissal policy instead. It's being hands-on and like getting and like being involved in the school and having like a real stake in like what the outcomes are. And like you said, getting that primary information. So sometimes that looks like, for some board members, that might look like physically showing up to the school and like walking through and like seeing what the experience is for kids. For others, it might look actually looking at that email with the budget in it and like going through the whole thing and like knowing what you're signing off on. It might look like looking at the school data for yourself. Because like I think one of the things, if you're watching this and you've never been to a charter board meeting before, every school leader reports their budget. They report what their curriculum they're doing. They report like how their teachers' evaluations are going, what their family surveys are saying. They report all these things to their board, and it's up to the board to take a hands-on approach and like really vetting those things and supporting and holding accountable if they feel like bars are not being met. And I think that like that's where like both like the community members who are board members and also community members who are part of the school come together, right? Is that like none of this can be done within, I think, any situation where you end up with a singular person or even just like one small group of people with like unilateral power, even if it's not actually unilateral, if it looks like that, I think that what you end up getting is like people's needs not being met. Like it's it is not possible.
It is protection of the system and not like the people within it. And I think a point that I always try to make is like, I think charters do provide us a pathway to like liberation from a system that necessarily that wasn't made to like really like for Black and brown children to thrive, right? Like it was created at the same time as like we did our redlining and all those things. And we created it as like one other way to like, it was created as one other way to kind of control a people and their prosperity. And I'm not saying that we have it 100% right, but I do think that, you know, we can think as big as small as we want. And I think that's part of like, my push is more like the more you understand what you got, the more you can understand what you don't, the more you can understand like what you need. And I think like we could be like, there are, you know, really unique charters that exist and they're just never part of the conversation because nobody's unhappy. Like, I think that there are some really great spaces. And I think that there are some spaces that need a lot of development and work. And I think to Kenny's point, you know, the board's job is to evaluate the school leader, but that's also to have a professional plan for them, right? Like I'm going to feel as like a human, right? Like leaders are not superhumans. They're not saying like, I am, you know, the 100% I have all the answers, but it is like important for us to understand where our leaders are. How do we support them both as a board? And then how do we support them like collectively? And then we can hold people accountable like to every standard because we've given we've laid it all out. We've given everyone all the
just like teachers.
Ways. Exactly. And I think we have to, and I think that thinking about your role as a board member, role in oversight, roles as a leader, like all of those are no different in your responsibility to do what you're promising to do for kids. And that's in your charter's mission.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. So I want to get to like one specific question that we got that I think is a good one. So someone said there's a lot of misinformation in New Orleans regarding our schools. Is there a place where resources can be found for people like learn and share? So like, is there like a one-on-one document somewhere that explains all of this, or should everyone just watch this video?
You should just watch me. No, so I actually think this information is a lot of places. I think, do you trust it? It's like, I actually think foundation is like, do we trust the information? Like I think like, it is not, I understand why people don't trust. It's like, you're telling me this is okay, but I don't trust you. So I'm not listening, right? Like I would rather to believe the other side of it. And so I think NOLA PS has great information on their site. I think like we try to put out LAPCS information, Urban League puts out information, Ed Navigator has information, but I do think like there is, you know, in psychology, they talk about the ability of people to like, if I don't like it, I'm going to focus my energies on the thing that I didn't like and more so than the thing that resonated or made sense. And so I do think it's like, how do we begin disseminating information that people trust is accurate, that is well balanced and informs them and makes them feel like they understand and they can go do. And I think that, I think there are many places. I think if you look at any nonprofit in education, they have a resource page with a bunch of information. I mean, even our charter book leader handbook is online for LAPCS. Even our board handbook is online for all the things that they're supposed to be doing. I think it's whether you trust the information. And if we don't, like, how do we learn to create trust across the board and not kind of just be stuck right where we are?
Yeah. So I have one last question for you before I let you go. And thank you so much for your time tonight and for the conversation. It's the same question I asked my last two guests. So the reason why we want to do these conversations at Indivisible NOLA is like one of the things we really focus on is like voter education. And like at the end of the day, we very rarely take stances in terms of like endorsing candidates or anything like that, because like, frankly, I don't think that the people of New Orleans need anyone else telling them how to vote. There's a lot of folks out there that say like, you know, here's a slate of endorsements, vote this way. I think that like what needs to be, and you know this about me on a personal level, I think what drives me crazy is that it's hard for people to make informed decisions because there just isn't enough clear information out there for them to decide themselves. We make it so hard for people to vote and then wonder why they don't vote. And so our goal is to try to like really educate voters and give them the information they need to make decisions. And so one of the things I've been talking about on each of these conversations is, like I said before, in our decentralized system, I really believe that it is up to our elected board members to be advocates for their communities and their constituents that they're serving. So I would ask you the same question I asked Neva and that I asked Amy. Is like, from your lens, from the lens of someone who thinks a lot about charter school oversight and accountability and how our system is run in this decentralized way, if you were running for school board, what would be the things that you would be advocating for in this arena? So as people start to think about what they would ask these school board members, because in a minute, I'm going to plug how we're going to have school board forums. So if like you were running for school board, what would be the things that you would be advocating for with this?
I would be advocating for increased transparency, communication, right? I don't think like I think that in order for people to start understanding and not feel kind of like stuck, there has to be a responsibility of like the why behind decisions. And I think it is our school board, our members that have to provide that why, right? Like they're the ones voting, they're the ones approving, they're the ones deciding that, you know, something is great, something isn't, like they like it, they don't. And I think the way we build trust in those other places we have information is actually by having understanding of why people are making decisions. And I think more often people are worried that it won't be the right answer for people. But I think people respect having an answer. And I think that's a big thing for across the board. I think it's really hard for me to advocate for the things I know, but I know them because like I've been in this work for 15 years, right? So I would say I would really want to increase transparency and just communication, and communication's not just like sending stuff out, right? Like I would push for better you know, what are some ways we can systematize like the ways we get information, the ways we communicate, the ways that we like you know, expand our point of view as school board members, right? Like how am I understanding what needs to happen, and how can I explain that to my constituents when I have information that they don't? And so as opposed to like acquiescing often, right? Because I think it's hard as an elected official. You need to get elected again to keep doing the work you feel like you want to do. But I also think like part of the job is to also educate constituents on like, hey, we're gonna talk about this together, and like till you get to a point of like, this is where we're at, and this is what we both understand about this. And I think you know, a better way of communicating, like and like including like other people, other community members, other stakeholders in the conversation. And the last thing I would say was I think ensuring that we are being the example we want for schools. I think that's really important. I think when I was a coach, if I had a teacher sitting on the floor, I was sitting on the floor. You know, like if like there was nothing that was ever that I wouldn't expect anyone else to do that I wouldn't. And I think that there isn't a ton of belief that happens. This isn't a value judgment, but I do think people, if they don't believe it's happening at the top, they're not going to believe, no matter what schools do, they're not going to believe it there either, right? Like if the people making the decisions if it is not clear that they are the bar, then the whole thing falls apart. And so that's kind of like where I'll be. I would make sure that we're as accountable as we expect the schools to be. We're as transparent as we need schools to be. And then I think the board members won't have a problem actually like asserting like exactly what needs to happen, because they know what it takes and they're doing it. So I think those are the three things I will say would be biggest.
You got to live it to expect it.
Right. I do want to add just a teensy bit. So to your point about how you're going to have your forums and stuff, LAPCS is a really cool resource coming out, and Zoe Reed, who's our communication person, would kill me if I like.
Well, feel free, plug away,
because I do respect her work, but I think it's like a really good faith effort to understand all of our candidates, not reform candidates, not traditional candidates, like all the candidates. And I think it'll be really, really important for like people to be able to see that as a place that they can look to as like unbiased, unfiltered. This is the information, and I can like look at this and make some type of determination about what I need.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for your time, Angele. I love always talking with you. You know, we talk about this all the time. Before I let everyone go, I'm going to give a couple of plugs. If you tuned in late to this and you missed most of it, would recommend you go back and watch from the beginning because Angele is brilliant. You can find this video and all the videos we've done, the one we did last night with Amy Grainer about One App, the one we did the night before with Neva Butkus about school funding. You can find it on our YouTube page, which is just Indivisible NOLA on YouTube. And keep an eye out coming up because we have a ton of school board, of not just school board, but election forums coming up. We're going to be doing a DA's forum. We're going to be doing a forum with an elected official explaining the constitutional amendments because in Louisiana, we love to write our constitutional amendments in languages that people just seem, it's almost like not English the way we write them. So we're going to have a forum where we literally have a state representative just explain to you what the constitutional amendments you're being asked to vote on are, so you can decide. We're going to have a forum, like I said, on the DA's race. We're going to have one where we explain what the DA does. And then we're going to top it all off with all seven school board races. We're going to have the candidates on. We're going to have them introduce themselves and take questions from you. And have an opportunity for you to get to know these people before you vote on November 3rd. And no matter what you do, please vote in every single election. They're all important, from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket. Vote every single time. Thank you guys for joining me. My name is Kenny Francis. I'm the Vice President of Indivisible New Orleans, and good night.